Nollywood on the Pulpit is an exploration of performance as a central aspect of Pentecostal expression by examining the strategies, techniques, and material forms adopted by adherents. I was raised in the Christian tradition, Pentecostalism specifically, although I've since come to reconsider that, but I'm still very engaged in observing the trends and shifts in the movement. The idea of using Nollywood as a framework to discuss how Pentecostalism is evolving seemed quite obvious because of the parallels in both movements. If you look at their origin, Nollywood came several decades after the first colonial films were made in Nigeria in the 1920s. But rather than try to replicate what was done before, filmmakers chose to reflect their audiences, to bring the Yoruba theatre tradition to screen, and of course the video film era followed. Likewise, Pentecostalism is a shift from the Christianity that the missionaries brought with them. Similarly, the creativity and the pioneering strategies that filmmakers brought to productions is also evident on the Pentecostal stage. More recently, there are also parallels to be drawn in the global expansion of both movements and how in later years they've been changed by success. Nollywood initially created low-budget productions that were enjoyed by local audiences, but their appeal, to my mind, really relied on the fact that they were low budget. They would often feature single take setups whereby any unintended action in the background, sometimes even in the foreground, would make its way into the final edit. The storylines were generally nonsensical, the special effects were very DIY, which meant that they were inventive and hilarious. The films were completely unashamed by exactly what was on offer. So if you wanted a cinema experience that was somber or melancholic, you would simply look elsewhere. You would choose something else. But what we've seen in recent years in the Netflix era are productions that are much more sleek, much more polished, which have enjoyed incredible commercial and critical success. You know, they've been shown at international film festivals. Lionheart was nominated for an Academy Award, and clearly they've gone global, and rightly so. But what you have is a void in which home audiences are still seeking the spectacle of old Nollywood. So where Pentecostalism comes in is in recognizing this gap and producing content, staging events, creating spectacular happenings and miracle healing, but not simply recreating what's been lost, but producing content and experiences that is immersive, in which audiences are given the opportunity to be the subject of the miracles. They're given the platform to enjoy their moment in the spotlight. So I go to great lengths to describe this trend of old Nollywood playing out on the church stage, but I don't do so in a disparaging way or in a condemnatory way. Quite the contrary, I don't think that any religion should be above subversion. In fact, I think these developments are welcome, and I write with admiration almost about a lot of these self-proclaimed prophets and preachers who, through their antics, are redefining Pentecostalism in the same way that Pentecostalism has changed Christianity, in the same way that Christianity has been changed and transformed through the ages. So, that being said, I don't intend to undermine the fact that even within these movements, there have been, and there is, financial and emotional exploitation, as well as gendered violence and child abuse. So my primary research interest really was looking at the ways in which power is manifested or instrumented against the individual within religious contexts, and the kinds of visceral responses or creative expression that can emerge from that process, especially when we look at theocratic imposition and the ways in which it imposes behavioral and arbitrary moral codes on its subjects, but more importantly, how they function within that system, what kinds of bodily responses are produced, what kinds of expressive and creative responses can be used to subvert an ideology that is repressive and dark and at times just inhumane. So in the Nigerian context, women are often the casualties. They're the ones often at the receiving end of these incidents. And so in the book, I spend some time looking at the tradition of women's literature, which came out of Islamic repression, which mirrors the subversive actions of Pentecostal women and also gay men in the church, in the choir, who collectively, through the medium of performance, are temporarily able to suspend the limitations that are otherwise imposed on them. So one of the aspects that was important for me to explore in this book is the question of gender and sexuality in Pentecostalism. That is how women and gay men function under religious imposition. So having outlined the ways in which Pentecostalism in Nigeria is in part fueled by the rise in Islamic fundamentalism, I look at the parallels between women's lives under Islamist repression and the actions of Pentecostal women. So women living under Islamic rule, particularly those in captivity of Boko Haram, have in recent years reawoken this practice of Hausa women's storytelling tradition of romantic fiction writing. For a lot of these women, their experiences of male-female relationships have been marked by violence, defined by violence. These women then adopt a tool for survival in which they reimagine what those relationships could be by writing romantic fantasy fiction. And when you consider that against the backdrop of Boko Haram's overarching mandate that women are to be denied education, it's really a poetic, profound response. It's a subversive response where women are reading, writing, sharing literature as a form of escapism from the confines of the environment and the moral codes imposed on them. Similarly, we can draw parallels with women in the South, Christian women, and how men can sometimes dictate the codes of conduct on the street in rural contexts, especially when women dress in a way that they might deem a provocation. Men would sometimes use their position and the supposed authority of religion, the authority of the church, Christianity, to impose correction and police women's behavior. Sometimes these corrective measures are actually abuse and exploitation. Yet when the setting changes and the same people are transported into the church, in the context of spirit worship, not only do those rules become suspended, but the power play is almost reversed. Suddenly, there are no boundaries as to how women can behave. Any utterance or movement is acceptable during spirit worship. Sometimes these performances of Holy Spirit consumption are incredibly full-bodied, they're euphoric, and visually they appear almost orgasmic. Women in the context of spirit worship can even take off layers of clothing and exhibit behaviors that would be suppressed outside the church. And so these moments in which women can unleash angst, release tension, offer ways in which Pentecostal women can and do subvert the limits imposed on them institutionally. We can also recognize these strategies of subversion in gay men in the choir. Often Pentecostal choirs would feature gay singers, dancers, musicians, keyboardists, choir masters who are so evidently camp in their mannerism, who in the moment of worship seemingly let go of any constraints about how a man might express himself, and who in the context of worship is emulated by a congregation who would otherwise have condemned him. He's performing uninhibitedly to an audience who derive pleasure from his talent and admire his musicality, yet at the same time, you have this refusal to recognize his sexuality. And so again, you have this process in which gay men are able to wield power through performance during those minutes of worship. They're leading the congregation, they're driving the atmosphere, they're commanding the greatest attention, even if it only lasts for a fleeting moment. So these combinations of subversive actions, in a way, also mirror the ways in which the Pentecostal movement itself has re-articulated what Christianity means to Africans in the 21st century. So performance is central to the book, and it's the framework for discussing the trends and shifts in Pentecostalism, and also the basis with which I try to make a case for understanding Pentecostal expressions as artistic forms in their own right. For instance, if you consider speaking in tongues, when you put it into context with other forms of vocal expression, whereby the voice is a key instrument and the performer is just merely uttering what are essentially nonsense syllables, but stringing it together, giving it rhythm, spirit, and soul. For example, in hip-hop, you have beatboxing, scatting in jazz. In Celtic music traditions, Irish music traditions, you have lilting and diddling. And so even within the church, there's a recognition of the art of performance of speaking in tongues. And young people in Pentecostal churches are organizing things like tongues of fire rap battles, where speaking in tongues is used performatively. So the music culture that has come out of this new form of Afro-Pentecostalism is somewhat different to gospel and deserves closer inspection. So really it's a book in two parts. So the first part looks at Pentecostal performance, but not only about miracle performance, but how the performativity of spirituality can spill over from church to society, and how in Nigeria it has, the ways in which prayer can function in public life, the ability to demonstrate proficiency in prayer can be weaponized and used to wield power or protest innocence. So it's become a tangible yardstick for measuring piety or morality. I also look at performance theatrics in the Pentecostal church by briefly looking at some of the most inventive, creative, and entrepreneurial preachers working today. And many of them root their antics in the historical lineage of messianic prophecy in Nigeria. Since the early 20th century, really, Nigeria has seen an array of self-professed healers, messiahs, and sorcerers who have dazzled the public with their ability to command a following and perform incredible feats. Some are lesser known prophets, but the ones that made a strong impression in the minds of Nigerians are featured. So there's a brief biography of some of them. People like Jesu Oyinbo, Jesus of Ikot Epene, Malaike, a prophetess, and other spiritualists like Prophet Eddie Nogu, Guru Maharaji, Olumbe. However, I throw in an unlikely character whose involvement in Pentecostalism, whose influence on the Pentecostal movement has never really been revealed or recognized. That person was Professor Pele, who was an eminent magician who transformed the ways in which Nigerians came to relate with magic. Traditionally, magic had functioned as a tool for divination, and so it served a functional purpose in society. But Pella's intervention, Pella's career, completely transformed the place of magic in society. He succeeded in representing magic as simply a series of illusions that can be an end in themselves and just serve as a form of entertainment, which is how we understand it in the West. But what's fascinating about his story is this link with Pentecostalism, because he never professed to possess supernatural powers. He merely presented himself as a modern master, a master of magic. But the people, in their own quest for experiencing the divine, this thirst for the supernatural, and their deep belief that the world is a spiritual place, actually projected onto him powers that he never claimed to possess. So rather than shy away from it, he simply ran with it. And in fact, he became the go-to man for Pentecostal leaders who were looking for ways to dazzle their audience with tricks, to perform miracles and make profits. So Pella devised a scheme in which he charged the preachers annual fees to teach them practical magic, but also impart on them, quote unquote, supernatural powers. And so you had this process in which the preachers who were commonly assumed to be charlatans were actually the ones being fooled by a greater illusion. So the book offers a brief biography of the various messiahs who shocked the nation with their antics. However, Pella, for me, holds the greatest intrigue because of the abrupt ending of his career. There are many parallels to be drawn between Nollywood and Pentecostalism in their ability to reflect their audiences and the ways in which those audiences actively engage with the material. I mentioned in the book that a Nollywood experience is incomplete if it's a solitary one. The films are edited and paced to allow dialogue and trigger conversations where viewers can predict or argue the outcome or recall similar experiences that they've had as they watch the action unfold on screen. So it's the same kind of active viewing that audiences take with them to church, only in church it becomes more heightened because the experience is an immersive one. Nigerians often believe that nothing is random, everything is written or preordained. So this strong belief in destiny shapes the way in which Nigerians understand the concept of celebrity and being eligible for blessings and miracles at particular times in their lives. The mantra that states, "I must not miss my blessing," suggests that everyone is destined to receive God's blessing at some point in their lives. They just need to be prepared. So when you combine this belief with the performance tradition of the Yoruba people, celebrated historically during communal festivals, street carnivals, or masquerade performances, Egungun festivals. So this coming together of belief and tradition, as well as the availability of this platform of the church stage, explains the desire of ordinary people to take to the stage and perform miracles. So this perspective offers a counterthought to the commonly accepted view of faith healing as events that merely employ actors to fake a miracle, because sometimes this process is also a collaborative one between the preachers and the congregation. And so the miracles are organic, but rather than being divine or supernatural, it's really people seizing the opportunity because they don't want to miss their blessing. This also goes in some way to explain why regular church attendance is so crucial, because in order to claim one's blessings, physical presence in church is required. Of course, there are many other reasons why people would go to church. You know, the social aspect is a huge part of that, as well as enjoyment of the music, the act of dressing up. The Sunday dress is a symbol of prestige, and it's traditional. It's a traditional rite of passage, and church attendance offers this continuity of experience that families share from generation to generation. So through their presence in church, audiences are that much closer to the possibility of experiencing a miracle. So when preachers offer proclamations about whose turn it is to receive a miracle, no matter how vague or abstract or wide-ranging the category, almost everyone tries to key in, to embrace that, to take that chance to claim their miracle. But in order to claim the miracle, it requires full-bodied participation and active dramatization that is almost like a performance in anticipation of the miracle. It's a visualization of what's to come, what might come. So it's a process that has to be performed to be made real, which goes in some way to explain why sometimes even the preachers are astonished by what they witness on stage. A deliverance session has so many different elements and characters, each operating with their own motivation, because sometimes the desire to be a vessel of the divine is just as great in the audience as it is on the stage in the preacher. So having explored the history and the growth of the movement, its expansion from Nigeria to the rest of West Africa and across East Africa, in Malawi, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and also in South Africa. And then later, its presence in Europe and what that means for those societies. So the second part of the book really looks at the trajectory of the movement and how Pentecostalism has migrated with Africans and the enormous challenges that come with that. When African nations gained independence, it was commonly believed that the appeal of Christianity would rapidly decline. But in fact, the opposite was what happened. And now what we have in effect is the reverse mission. So the reverse mission in action is a process in which Africans are re-articulating the missionary cause by bringing this firebrand form of Christianity to the West. There's a brief analysis of that process, looking at how African Pentecostals are seeking to change the world around them by implementing the social gospel as a response to the challenges that are endemic in their communities. And given the facts that the church represents the greatest, largest collective force in Black communities and the sheer numbers involved, there are economic, political, and of course, cultural ramifications that ought to be examined.